How do we work productively with anger? Freud thought anger and sexuality were the two things hardest to negotiate with society, that both of those issues put your individual needs often in conflict with those of others. And so sexuality and anger are areas that we repress in order to fit in and belong in culture. But we pay a big price for that. And today I'm going to go into how to be with your anger, surface your anger, and accept your anger. Here are a few videos. We're going to start with, this is two wolves that are actually siblings, brothers, and you can see a dominance display here. The one wolf is clearly showing aggression, and you can see the snarled jaw, you can see the bracing in the shoulders and the neck area, and there's tension throughout the body that communicates ready to pounce, ready to attack. And that's intended to make the other animal back down. So this animal is clearly showing its dominance, which is all about appearing strong and powerful and protecting territory. This small dog is provoking this larger dog. At first he puts up with it, it's starting to get annoyed, then snaps, and you see this facial aggression coming through and a bark that protects the food that the dog is in front of. It's signaling that it's not wanting to play and that it does not want the other dog in its territory. Here we have a man trying to clip the nails of this dog, and the dog is clearly not having it, and the nail clippers clearly represent danger to that dog, and so it's defending itself against the nail clippers. You can see the lips pull back so that the teeth show, and that's a big part of animal aggression, and aggression in the eyes and the ears as well, just a kind of bracing pattern that shows that this dog is not going to accept the nail clipping. So, anger in humans. Firstly, why do we care? Swallowing anger or suppressing or repressing anger is not good for your health. And Gabor Mate writes about this in When the Body Says No. Chronic pain, chronic health conditions involve this personality type where there's a suppression of anger. And the person is somewhat of a doormat or a compulsive caregiver, or always looks after others and can't defend its own self and can't stand up for its own needs. Freud famously referred to depression as anger turned inward, and the idea is that when we can't express our anger outwardly, particularly against a caregiver, then we blame ourselves, and that turns our aggression against ourselves and shuts us down. And so not expressing your anger and holding your anger turns into depression in Freud's mind. And there's a lot to be said for that. Healthy aggression is necessary. We need to stand up for ourselves. There are cases where boundaries do need to be protected. We do need to stand up against bullies, and we need aggression. You can't do without aggression. Anger is commonly repressed. We are not rewarded for having anger in culture, and so we commonly suppress any anger that we feel. And we don't just not express it, we even deny it to ourselves or act like it doesn't exist, even when we're angry. Often someone else can tell that you're angry more easily than you can tell that you yourself are angry. And it's displaced. If you're angry at work but you can't express it there, then your anger leaks out in other places where you feel safer, with your children or your partner. And so displacement of anger is very, very common, and that's another reason we don't want to bottle up anger, because we can't effectively do that, and it does leak out. Anger is a defensive pattern, and it's all around defense and acting. So if we have anger, then we defend ourselves. If we don't have anger, then we don't have that defensive system. And linked to that action is the retardation of the action, which is bracing. So anger is commonly experienced as a tightness in the muscles where we want to punch, but we hold ourselves back, and that tension is the anger. So bracing and anger go hand in hand. And so if we have long-term anger that's bottled up, we'll have long-term bracing. It's not hard to see that anger is a guardian or a protector, that it serves a defensive function, it protects our vulnerable aspects, and there's a primary emotion, anger. Often anger, say that anger is a secondary emotion, that it's covering something else, but it can also act as a primary emotion, and that is just straightforwardly to defend our territory or ourself. And as a secondary emotion, it can be safer to express anger than grief or fear, particularly in males. It doesn't show weakness, so anger tends to take the place of other emotions. And we channel our emotion into anger when actually there's something deeper going on. As a stage of grief, anger is expressed as a non-acceptance of an outcome, whereas grief or sadness is accepting the outcome. So anger can be a kind of temporary place where we reside in order to rebel against an injustice, the universe, and when we finally do accept it, the anger turns to sadness. That's fairly common. Projection and introjection, using Fritz Perls' definitions of these terms. Projection, we locate the problem outside of ourselves, so we get angry at someone else for something that's something about us. Or the opposite, we may introject. We may take on a problem that's to do with someone else as our own problem and blame ourselves, and then get angry at ourselves for something that's really not ours. So these two processes, projection and introjection, are very commonly involved in anger. Anger is straightforwardly fight or flight. If you look on these diagrams here, it's somewhere between 2 and 15 seconds to the peak of anger. So it's a fairly quick emotion, and there's a surge of energy through the body. A lot of our somatic work is noticing when we're angry and allowing that, softening into the anger, really feeling it as energy moving through the body. And when we do that, we move through the wave of anger, and then we have options, and we can act for the anger, not from the anger. So if we just act at the peak of that wave, we're going to do things that we regret. Whereas if we can experience the wave, the energy moves through, and then we can still act in a way that protects our interests, but with better options, taking more information into account. On the left, you see a regulated system where the sympathetic system, the anger, comes down, triggering the parasympathetic system, equal and opposite that neutralizes, brings us back to baseline. And then on the right there, you see unresolved anger, where the parasympathetic is not well regulated. It's not coming in properly. Maybe we use thoughts to keep anger in place, or in some way we deny or don't express the anger. Then the anger stays there and we don't clear it, so we don't get back to baseline. Anger has a very recognizable physiology, from rage down to a more mild irritation. Brows are furrowed, the eyes are often narrowed, as if we're protecting the eyes. The lips snarl, showing the teeth, or we purse the lips, which blocks the show of teeth. So that's a case where we're bracing against the anger. And the muscles brace, particularly arms and fists, to block action, to block starting a fight. And there's tension in the jaw, neck, shoulders, and back. So there's a kind of rigidity about anger. Heart rate and respiration increase, blood flows to the arms, legs, and face, sweaty hands, dry mouth, which is because the whole digestive system slows down or stops, and we do motions that are warming up for a fight. For instance, cracking the knuckles or getting our arms ready for action. So those are classic signs of anger. Charles Darwin, in the expression of emotions in man and animals, makes a lot of linkages between emotions in animals and in humans, and how important the emotional expression systems are. Darwin was very tuned into that. So how do we work with anger? Often if we have anger that's bottled up or suppressed, there's some kind of interrupted self-protective response. So there's something we wanted to do that we weren't able to do. So in somatic sessions, often there'll be gestural things that emerge. There's an obvious thing that's wanting to happen, some kind of pushing, or pushing an assailant off, or kicking the legs. That's often a kind of a flight response, but it can also be kind of kicking the assailant, or some kind of movement that expresses defending your territory. And so often in the work, we look for little subtle traces where a movement is organizing, hasn't yet found expression, and it was interrupted during the attack, and it's become part of our implicit memory system, and so it hasn't been able to complete. So completing angry gestures can be an important aspect in session. Boundary restoration In somatic work, we do exercises where you walk toward each other and notice when your physiology gives you the signal that you need to set a boundary. We also, do things like pushing a pillow against someone and pushing them away, and doing different exercises that show that you can defend your territory. Trauma collapses boundaries, so a lot of somatic work is to reestablish boundaries and reestablish healthy aggression. So taking up space involves some degree of aggression. So we need to restore our aggression. Often that's gone away with trauma. Anger as not a problem, so you might be angry about something, but the anger itself is not an issue, not a problem. And as you are able to just feel the anger more, it's just a wave of energy, and then more and more you can accept it, and it doesn't cause you any problems. You just feel it come through, and then you decide how to act with it. So anger itself becomes a lot less threatening as you work with it. The gap between stimulus and response is your freedom. Widening that gap, feeling the anger, not acting immediately, giving yourself time to absorb the anger, metabolize it, and then decide how to act. Finding the real source of anger. Often we're still holding on to rage. For instance, you might have been angry at your father, and now you project that onto authority figures or institutions, and really it's about your father. If you can process the rage, really understand it, and really express it, then you'll stop projecting it onto current objects, and then you'll see things more clearly, and you might be able to use some authority figures, use institutions, and not rebel against things unnecessarily. So understanding what anger is from your past, your childhood, versus what anger is to do with the current situation, because there are current things that should draw your ire. And then how much of the anger are you directing at self that really should be directed at someone else, or vice versa. More common is that you direct anger at yourself that should be going to someone else, particularly a parent or some kind of important figure in your early life. Healthy places for aggression: exercise, sport, sex, performance arts, music, comedy. These are places where our aggression can be well received and can be valuable to others who relate. And sexual aggression, a lot of sexuality involves a polarity where there is aggression and it's received. It's actually not a problem. Anger in relationship. Acting out anger by just screaming, or opposite, stonewalling, going silent, is a sure way to trigger your partner's anger and their own protectors. And so we want to be careful about expressing our anger. I'm okay with my anger, so I'll, get angry at you. That can be counterproductive, and sometimes that's necessary, and that can break through something that's happening, but generally it's not a good idea to just speak from the anger. So instead, there's an IFS concept of speaking for a part rather than speaking from the part. And that involves a little bit of unblending or defusing. So we have to first feel the anger, we come down, and then, okay, how am I going to actually defend myself? How am I going to represent the case of this protector without just being the protector? And when your partner can hear that you're a little bit unblended and you're not possessed by the anger, then your partner can listen to what you're saying. And so it's much more likely that you'll come to a solution that works. We may need to learn to tolerate guilt in expressing anger or setting boundaries. That is the mechanism that keeps us in check with culture. That is our own security guard, our guilt. So in expanding our anger, we might expose ourselves to that negative feeling of guilt that comes after. And learning to tolerate that guilt and expand our range can be an important thing to do. Then in relationships, I statements are always a good idea. Speaking from your experience, not using you statements. It's just easier to receive, and it shows a bit of self-energy that you're able to use an I statement. And then having kill switches or cooling off periods where when you reach a certain level of anger, you disengage. At some point, nothing useful gets done. John Gottman has written about this in their lab with couples counseling. When someone's heart rate goes over a certain point, they literally stop the session and they regulate the nervous systems. Nothing useful will be done at that point. Ideal is you stay in the same place and you regulate yourselves through mindfulness or push-ups or a shower that moves the anger, or you leave the space and you tell your partner when you'll come back in order for them not to feel abandoned, and then you allow your system to come down before you reconnect. That's all we'll cover on anger. Basically, anger is a good thing. We want anger, we want healthy aggression, but it's a feeling that we need to be able to experience, and we don't just want to act out of anger. We want to be able to experience our anger and then act in the way that's most suitable. And so when the wave of anger comes through, we lose self-energy up at the top, and then as the anger comes down, we go back into parasympathetic, we gain self-energy again. And then that's the place where we should act from.